sessions. Our guest this morning is Stephanie Saldaña. Stephanie is a writer, a teacher, a journalist, specializing in religious diversity in the Middle East. She's done extensive work with the refugee population in the Middle East. She is currently living in Bethlehem with her husband, Frederick, and their 3 children. Stephanie is the author of, Stephanie, I would say 3, but I haven't read the 3rd one because it's not out yet. So I have to say 2 fantastic books. The first is called The Bread of Angels, which is a spiritual memoir about her time living in Syria. The second is A Country Between, which is a stunning memoir of her time in Jerusalem. And coming in 2023 is her latest book called What We Remember Will Be Saved. Stephanie, by way of introduction to our conversation, and for those of you gathered this morning, again, thank you for being here. In the article that you shared with us from the Jesuit Review, you quoted Walter Burgart, who inspired you to take a long, loving look at the real. And I think that sums up much of what you do as a writer, as a journalist. You were a young woman from the southwestern United States who ended up living in Syria. So let's start this morning by you sharing with us that part of your story. Over to you. Thank you.
Thank you so much for inviting me. It's really a privilege to be with you. We thought that I would share a little bit about my journey, and we would break it up with some conversation as I move between sections. So I'm going to start really with the story of how I arrived in the Middle East. I grew up in San Antonio, Texas, and a family that had been there for quite a long time, for some 14 generations. So I was very tied to my city. I grew up in a very Catholic family. And I grew up really with the Bible as story. The Bible, I went to Catholic school, so we would hear it, in Mass every week, and then a Mass on Sunday, I would hear it a second time. So these were really the stories that I grew up with. And when I went away to college, I went to school in Vermont, and I grew away from my faith, but I grew into my writing. And I knew that I couldn't avoid the stories of my life. So I really went back to the Bible as story in that period. And when I graduated, I won something called the Thomas Watson Fellowship. Thomas Watson Fellowship is this kind of crazy fellowship that allows people to do the craziest thing that they could ever dream of. The stranger, the better. It was 1999, 2000. And I wanted to write poetry within 2,000 years of Christianity. So I decided I would just go to 2 places. This is how narrow my worldview was. 2,000 years of Christianity, I would spend 6 months in Israel and 6 months in Rome. So I arrived in Jerusalem. I was 22 years old. And that first week, I walked to Bethlehem. I didn't know anything about Palestinians, nothing about Muslims, nothing about Eastern Christians, nothing about the Arabic language. But there I was walking. And I remember somebody calling to me and saying, "Why are you walking? Do you want to be like Jesus?" And I was like, I was 22. I said, "Yeah." I guess so. And so I didn't even know where Bethlehem was. At that point, there was no separation wall. So I just stopped at the side of the road after I'd been walking for a long time. And I went into a shop and I said, "Is this Bethlehem?" And there was a Palestinian working there. And he said, "No, it's not Bethlehem, but wait a second and I'll take you there." So I waited and I got into his car and he drove me into Bethlehem. And I got out in Nativity Square and I went into a shop and I said, "Is this Bethlehem?" He said, "Yeah." And I said, "Well, do you know of a place to stay?" And he said, "Wait a second and I'll take you there." So then I got in his car, we went to a road somewhere and we started knocking on doors. And so we arrived at this convent, and this young religious sister named Hannah, she opened the door and he asked her, do you have any place for her to stay? And she just laughed and she said, well, we always imagined we'd have guests, and I guess we just found our first one. And so they took me in, and I really felt, for me, it was a real conversion experience. I could really feel God with me in this journey. And it was a community of Palestinian Christians who, and so it was the first time I knew that that existed. And I prayed with them and I spent time with them. And then the next day I walked into Bethlehem and I went to the Church of the Nativity. And when I was there, a man said, would you like for me to show you around? So I said, sure. So he showed me around. And after about an hour, after I'd seen everything in the church, he said, by the way, do you know I'm a Muslim? And I said, no. And he said, are you confused why a Muslim would show you around the birthplace of Jesus? And I said, yes, absolutely. And he said, well, he's our prophet too. So in the space of 2 days, sort of my worldview was changed drastically. So I went back to the convent and I said, I want to meet Muslims. To which the religious sister said, no, it's too dangerous. I kept begging them. And then I eventually, I don't know why, I started to cry. They felt very bad for me. And so we decided, all of us, to go house to house. So we just went house to house, knocking on doors and meeting people. And I remember, I mean, it's more than 20 years ago now, but there was this wonderful family that had built this model of the Dome of the Rock. And you could press little things and the rooms would light up in it. And they invited us in and we spent time with them. And that was it. I went and I traveled a bit. And then I came back maybe a month or two later. And the sisters said, oh my gosh, we want to tell you something. We want to tell you something. And I said, what? And they said, well, we needed somebody to come work cleaning and doing some things in the convent. And this young Muslim girl showed up at our door to apply for the job. And we said, do we know you? And she said, yeah, don't you remember you came to my house and you were so kind to me? And so she worked in the convent. And that was also another conversion moment for me. That was a moment when I sort of understood that it's all about relationship and that it's actually really easy. It's just taking the time to meet people and to be kind and to receive their kindness. I wrote to my scholarship and I said, well, I heard there are Christians in Egypt. Can I go there? So they said, yes. So I went to Egypt and then said, well, I heard there's also Christians in Jordan. Well, by the time the end of the year came, I changed my entire scholarship and I was in Egypt, Jordan, Syria, Turkey, and falling in love with the region. So shortly after that, I started as a journalist in Lebanon, in Beirut. And the week that I arrived, September 11th happened. And I was working for a paper, a local paper called the Lebanese Daily Star. And it was a paper for Lebanese people, but written in English. And it was this moment of huge tension. And I was challenged to think, what do Lebanese people want to hear about? And I was writing about things that had nothing to do with war. I was writing about art, I was writing about culture, I was writing about music. And that was another moment for me that asked for a conversion, you know, to really ask, how do people see themselves? How can, what is keeping you from seeing people as they are? Eventually, at the end of that year in Lebanon, I realized that I'd sort of reached a wall, that if I wanted to know the region better, I needed to learn Arabic, I needed to study Islam, and I needed to study Eastern Christianity. And that's when I've been back to the States to do my master's at Harvard. Following that, I had a Fulbright to go to Syria, to spend a year in Syria. That was 2003, 2004, the war in Iraq. It was not an easy time to be an American in Syria. I had a project to write about the prophet Jesus in Islam. And I lived in the Christian quarter. I learned Arabic from my neighbors and the university. And there were two, I would say, 2 or 3 huge things that happened to me in Syria. One was that I befriended a female sheikh who taught me the Quran and welcomed me into her home, and eventually welcomed me to teach in her mosque. That's much of what my first book is about. Second is that I went to a monastery in the desert called Deir Musa, which is a monastery where Muslims and Christians are in dialogue. It's a Christian monastery where they have a vocation to welcome Muslims. Thousands of Muslims went there every year. And the third thing that happened in Syria was that I went to that monastery and became friends with a certain French novice monk named Frederic, who I fell in love with and who left, and we became married. He's now my husband, and he's now a married priest in the Syriac Catholic rite. I think if any of you read my book, A Country Between, that's probably where you know the most recent phase of my life has been living in Jerusalem for 16 years, on the seam between East and West Jerusalem for much of it. And then eventually now we have just this year moved to Bethlehem. I'll just talk for a few minutes about living in Jerusalem and writing A Country Between. It's a book which is really about the diversity of Jerusalem, about the incredibly rich traditions of people who live in Jerusalem. And I happen to live on a street where you could really see this. You could just see this in every single person. You could see it in the birds who flew overhead. You could see it in the people passing through. And when I started to write the book, I thought, I'll write a book about East Jerusalem. And then I said, oh, I'll write a book about my street. And then finally I said, okay, I'll write a book about the first 200 meters of my street. And it was where I really learned that you can focus on something very small, and that can reveal something much bigger. I mean, in a sense, it's a parable. So it's something small, which for me told me something about the kingdom. And so I just tried to go deeply into that to understand something about the people, the birds, the beauty, the tension, and from that to really contemplate what it means to participate in eternity. Here, I've spent a lot of time now that I've moved to Bethlehem. I live about 10 minutes from the Church of the Nativity. I, of course, like everyone else, have to go through checkpoints to get anywhere. There's a lot of tension. And I spend a lot of time thinking about what we can do, what I can do. And I think living in Bethlehem has really helped me to think about God as Emmanuel, about God with us, and what it means to try to witness that by being with others, and that simply being with is an act. Simply being in the presence of others, simply being attentive to others, simply having relationships with others. I gave the example when we were preparing for this. I was talking about, we have these Muslim bakers who live in front of our house. So they're they take care of us. They let us know, they keep us safe, essentially. And we had our feast day, the Feast of St. Joseph. Our church is St. Joseph's. And on that day, there was a huge bouquet of flowers. Who was it sent by? It was sent by our Muslim bakers. And so when their feast day came, of course, we sent them something. And for me, that's the thing. We can talk about the big things. We can talk about sort of dialogue in the grand sense. But for me, dialogue and love, relationship, all of those things are lived out in these small details of them honoring us, of us honoring them, of our desire that they can be more fully themselves when they're with us, and we can become more fully ourselves in being with them. Just one last thing, and then we'll have a little conversation. My life has been very deeply influenced by the times in which I've been here. My teacher in Syria, Father Paulo Dololio, who was really my teacher, he was kidnapped by ISIS and disappeared. He is presumed dead. Another teacher who I admired deeply, Franz van der Loot, who used to lead walks with Muslims and Christians in Syria. He was killed in Homs. Another person who has become a dear friend, also a member of the monastery, Jacques Murad. He was also kidnapped by ISIS. He was rescued by his Muslim neighbors and friends. In fact, all of the Christians of his village were rescued by their Muslim neighbors. And my sheikha, my Muslim teacher, she also had to flee because of the war. And so a lot of my faith is simply lived in the reality of having known these witnesses, having known these people of faith, of reading the Gospels in the light of the ultimate price people pay for it. And not just the Gospels, people of other faiths who pray, who pay that price. Having known all of those people, still my greatest influence from the modern times is somebody you may have heard of, somebody I never met, named Christian de Chergé. Christian de Chergé was the abbot of the monks of Tiberine, who stayed in Algeria during the war. There's a very beautiful movie called Of Gods and Men about their decision to stay. He stayed to give his life for his Muslim neighbors, and the monks who stayed were killed, but that's not why I admire him. I admire him because, for a lot of reasons, but when he was there, and when he and the brothers were deciding whether they should stay or leave, he gave a talk which has become known as the Martyrdom of Love. It's about a talk which was given by Jane de Chantal, another French saint, in which he quotes her and basically says, what does it mean to give your life? There's regular martyrs, of whom I have known many, but there are martyrs of love. And martyrs of love aren't people who are killed for their faith. Martyrs of love are people who give their life entirely, but piece by piece. And that's really inspired me to think, what does it mean to live in a difficult place and to give your life? Not give your life necessarily by having it taken, though I have known some people to whom that's happened, but to give your life over and over again in, as he says, all sorts of little things which can be the way you talk to your neighbor, the way you love your children, the way you talk to a soldier, the way you love your enemy. I don't in any way claim to have accomplished this even a little bit, but the desire to know how to give my life little by little is, I think, what guides me in living in a place like this. So I guess that's a good start. And if you want to ask some questions.
It's a fantastic start, Stephanie. And I think I'm probably not alone in the room right now when you just said, you think you might do that just a little bit with your own life. That's a humble statement from you. So what I'd love to do with you for this next short segment would be to talk about bearing witness. Along the way with this program, which grew out of a conversation that's happening in the Episcopal Church and in other churches about this what we call BDS, boycott, divest, and sanction, and the debate in the church about calling what's happening between Israel and Palestine apartheid. We had decided in this last section to talk with someone like you because we want to think about how it is that we bear witness in a loving way, in a Calvary way, to use one of your words, and not in a political way. So can you share with us and maybe teach us a little bit about what we can do or what I can do by talking about the role of a writer in conflict?
Sure. I mean, I think I love that you began with this quote of a long, loving look at the real, because I think every single word in that quote is so important. A long, which is really Emmanuel, that's staying with, loving, look, that is witness, and at the real, that is the truth. So every single aspect of that is for me something essential in what it means to engage in contact. Long, that means not only sort of learning about it, but fidelity to the people in it. I mean, that's so important. Fidelity, they call this here samud in Arabic. That means staying. So staying, whether it's in your prayers or in your relationships or in your learning, this commitment to something, that's the long. The loving is for me the heart of it. I mean, God is love and God is relational. We spoke before a little bit about, for me and my relationships, which are bound by love your neighbor. So whoever my neighbor is, whoever, I must love that person. And so for me as an individual, that becomes the way in which I participate and witness the Gospels. But every person has to discern for themselves what their role is. I can't tell anyone else what their role should be. And I am constantly discerning what my role should be. And at the real is the hardest part for me. At the real is really, it's Calvary. It's Calvary. It's really staying awake to what's happening, being honest about it, really praying about what are those things that might be keeping me from saying the truth, discerning when it's helpful to speak and when it's helpful to stay silent. What is best? That is a question, and that always has to be discerned. What is best? What is helpful? What is coming out of my ego, or what is actually helpful to the situation? And that no one else can give an answer to. That is something that is always to be discerned by an individual and by a community. But for myself, as a writer, writing really becomes for me the way in which I hope that I participate in witness. So for me, my writing is rooted in the incarnation. So that means that I write with the trust that the world around me is telling me something about God, that God is communicating through the things I see, the birds, the flowers, but also every human interaction, whether it's a difficult one or a fruitful one. So writing about these things, describing about these things is also for me a way of trying to discover how God is communicating to me in the world. And I think that's what differentiates spiritual memoir or spiritual writing from other kinds of nonfiction. But another thing, and this really comes into my work with refugees, is my belief in incarnation really makes me believe that every human being is absolutely unique. Every person is made in the image of God. And so part of writing about a person is trying as best as I can to capture their uniqueness, to be faithful to their uniqueness. And I hope all of my relationships come out of that too, trying to be faithful to recognizing and then sharing what is unique in every person that I meet, which you captured so beautifully in that prayer that you started. And another thing about bearing witness, when in Syria, when I left Syria, something very interesting happened in the war for me, which is that I was watching the Civil War unfold, and two people were being targeted. journalists were being targeted and religious were being targeted. Of course, also all kinds of other people, political figures. But for me, when I was watching journalists being killed for staying, and I was watching religious people being killed for staying, many of, these are the two communities I'm embedded. I realized, oh my gosh, there is something in common here, that something about deciding to stay to write about something and deciding to stay out of your faith. For me, there's something deeply profound about both decisions. As you know, the word witness, the word martyr, it comes from witness. And for me, somebody who really captured that was James Foley. James Foley, who grew up deeply religious, and out of that grew a call to become a writer, and he was eventually killed for that. But before he was killed, as many of you know, there's incredible stories about how he cheered up the other inmates, how he figured out games for them to play, how there's a lovely line about him. Somebody said he became smaller so that the room there would be more space in the room. And so people who were in prison with him really talk about this incredible quality that he had. And so for me, I'm sort of balancing these two things which are dear to me, the desire to write and the desire to live out of my faith. And they're both deeply, deeply tied. And I guess one last thing is that a friend of mine, well, my friend, Brother Emile, who's at Thèse, he claims that he thinks that every writer only really writes about one thing over and over again. And I would say that if I write about one thing, that the one thing that I write about is what Simone Weil calls the physics of grace, but what other people have called the bad math of the Bible. And the bad math of the Bible is, of course, this emphasis on the small, this idea that small things matter. The mustard seed and the leaven in the flour, and the one who was sought after from the 99, this belief that little things matter, and that the little things that we do matter. Here, the Christians were 1% of the population, and so we really sort of quite literally live out that hope in this bad math, that we as a very small community matter, that what we do matter, that our presence matters, that our prayers matter, that our witness matters, even though it doesn't seem to make sense mathematically. And so you might have noticed in the way that I write that very often when there's a difficult moment, I will sort of lean into something beautiful. And that desire is to both witness what is terrible, but also witness this bad math, which is that the beautiful is stronger than the terrible. That grace, a mustard seed of grace, as Simone Weil said, is stronger than all of the evil in the world. And so when I'm writing, I'm trying to authentically talk about the terrible things, while at the same time giving witness to this bad math, my belief that something small really matters. And I found a little page in the book where I do that. So I thought I would just read it so you could see how I think about this bad math. So this is from A Country Between, where I'm just simply writing about the birds that fly over our house. So I'll just read. Even at my most exhausted, I could summon up the courage to walk onto the terrace and wait for the birds to appear. The family of pigeons who had greeted us when we arrived never left, and they laid their nests in the windows of the house. Now and then we'd find a shattered egg on the staircase. Now and then a small, still fragile bird. Sunbirds found their way to the wine-colored, collapsing shells of pomegranates, and at breakfast, we could watch the beating of their wings through the windows. Then there was the afternoon when Frederick pointed out a ringneck parakeet squawking in the highest branches of our tree, a strange transplant from a distant tropical forest. He did not stay, but on rare afternoons, we would see him passing through to rest, with his elegant green feathers, red-rimmed eyes, and red beak, cut off from his original homeland and now with nowhere left to go. The hoopoe, known as King Solomon's messenger, appeared with his long black bill and distinct black and white wings, as did the robin redbreast, which Ledsenstedt had stood by the cross of Jesus, its chest pricked red by the thorns on his crown. Above the birds lay thousands of stars, with names like Ahranar, meaning the end of the river, or Al-Humayze, the bleary-eyed one, from when Arab astronomers first witnessed them more than 1,000 years ago. And beneath us, another layer, for our house was just beyond the city walls, where the dead were traditionally buried, and so it made sense that they would pile up in layers in centuries around the places of my daily life, where I bought my bread and drank my coffee. Those first several months, we moved along the gentle crust between the birds and the dead. There is that which is hidden that is terrible, and that which is hidden that is beautiful. They appeared in turn. But when the beautiful came, I tried to turn to it and call it by name. Maybe love was always, in the end, composed of this noticing, the small gesture repeated over and over again until it becomes the country in which we live. And so it's really not only noticing the small, but by praying with it, writing about it, paying attention to it, that we believe that we can expand the good, make a greater place for the good, and finally live in the good, even if we're surrounded by things which are difficult.
Stephanie, yeah, I love this notion of bad math, and as a shameless plug, as a preacher on behalf of my colleague Geoffrey, I remember Reinhold Niebuhr once saying, any preacher, no matter how good they are, only has 11 sermons to preach. They just need to figure out how to word them differently. So it sounds like they're saying something new. On the back, we're gonna close today with a poem by a certain poet who said about your book, A Country Between, Saldaña's astonishing gifts of perception make a country between feel like the country we should all prefer to live in. And I think that, in combination with a long, loving look at the real, is part of what our conversation is about today, which is living and looking at things differently. And I think the kinds of things that you're talking to us about today require from us a different kind of paying attention to what's happening in the world and what is happening around us. One of the remarkable pieces of the conversation that we had with Yossi Klein Halevi last week was Yossi talking about how he had changed over time, and what a different book Letters to My Palestinian Neighbor is than the first book he wrote, called At the Entrance to the Garden of Eden. So before we hand this over to Geoffrey for the Q&A and the questions in the chat, which I am not looking at, I want to talk with you, hear from you a little bit about the changing landscape, your changing landscape, and whether or not your outlook and your ability to perceive has changed over time from this move from Syria to your time at Tantor with Geoffrey, and then now Bethlehem. Would love to hear about your current book and your work with refugees, and finally, what it means to you to live, and this is pointing back to how we perceive, to live so close to, I believe these are your words, living as close as you do to the landscape of the Gospels.
Sure. I would say the biggest change that's happened to me is simply that now I've lived half of my life in the Middle East. And so the extent to which I am an insider and an outsider has changed. I think that when I wrote my first book, for example, it was with a lot of fondness for people, but they were still, in my experience, people who were very different from me. Whereas now I think my experience of the region is simply my friends, my neighbors, the people who I've been with for half of my life now, most of my adult life. So that's been a huge transformation for me. I have 3 children, and one of them was born briefly when we were in a brief couple of months in the Alps, but the other 2 were born here. All 3 have lived their whole lives here. In that way, the way I experience the conflict is different. It's not abstract. It's something which we also live through and experience and struggle with. One thing that has changed for me profoundly, I think if I talk about Jacques Murad was somebody who I didn't know really when I was in Syria, but I wrote a long piece about him and so interviewed him for 18 hours, I think, in Iraq. He is a monk from Syria who lived in a community called Qaryatayn, half Muslim, half Christian. But they all were devoted to this saint, Mar Elian, who was who was buried in the outside of his church. And they believed that this saint gave miracles to Muslims and Christians. So he saw as his flock everybody. His flock was everybody. I believe Archbishop Hossam talked about this too. The flock is everybody. The flock is both Muslims and Christians. The flock is everybody with whom you live. He took care of everybody during the war. And he was kidnapped and held by ISIS for 5 months. His parishioners were kidnapped, and then, as I said, they were rescued by their Muslim neighbors. One of the things that touched me was him telling me about when he was kidnapped and telling me about his faith and about how his faith guided him while he was in prison. And why do I say that? Because I think in my head, I always had this idea, okay, I have my faith, but there's limits. And someday, something so terrible is going to happen to me that I'm going to lose my faith. And when you come to know people for whom the most terrible thing has happened, and they still live out their faith, there's a huge freedom in that, and the discovery that faith really has no limits, that nothing can kill this, that the relationship with God, it really is stronger than death, that the resurrection is real. The resurrection is real and it's now. And so for me, knowing that sort of as something I'd learned when I studied theology to something that I'd witnessed in people who had lived it, that has changed me profoundly. And that's been a gift. You meet this here. There are people in the church who have lost family members and still know how to love, still know how to witness, who haven't lost that, who have deep, deep faith in God. So that's been a huge transformation for me, to really witness the limits of this thing we called faith. And that is that it has no limits, that it really is the resurrection. That we really are the people of Easter, as they say, that we are meant to witness a love that is stronger than everything, even death. In 2016, I started a project because I simply couldn't handle not being involved with Syrians and Iraqis anymore. My church is the Syriac Catholic Church, and the largest community of Syriac Catholics was in Karakosh, which was a city that completely emptied out in 2014 when ISIS came. So I was personally very invested in what was happening in northern Iraq and in Syria. And so I got funding to start a project to basically travel all over the world and meet Iraqi and Syrian refugees and to ask them what they saved, what they rescued. It was on the surface, it's about intangible cultural heritage. So people saved dresses that had stories in them. They saved songs, they saved recipes, they saved their dying languages. So it was really about trying to discover what people can carry with them. But as I spent more time with them, I always discovered that they saved something deeper. For example, a pharmacist who remade her pharmacy in her garage during the war, she talked about saving compassion, that she didn't want the ability to be kind to be lost during the war. Or a musician told me that he wasn't saving music, he was saving joy. And from then, I just also learned what can't be taken from us. These people who had been through the limits, who had lost their homes, their countries, in some cases family members, and yet they had saved something. And that's not just resilience. For me as a Christian, that's resurrection. They'll call it, those who are of other faiths will have another way of describing it. But it's this ability to triumph over death and despair. It's hope. But hope which is more radical than any I'd ever known before meeting them. It was also my first experience with Yazidis, which has been very powerful for me to move beyond Abrahamic faiths and to know even more deeply the diversity in the region. Another thing that has changed for me is just how familiar the Bible has become for me. When we lived, after we lived on Nablus Road, we lived in a small house in the old city. And my sons used to play soccer in the courtyard. And the neighbor would get so mad at them for playing soccer. And I was like, why are you mad? Like, they're just little kids playing soccer in the courtyard. Well, then I learned that the bush that was next to her house was a cutting of the burning bush. And so she was afraid that the soccer ball was going to knock down the burning bush. The house next to us, well, the church next to us, directly next to us, was where St. Nicholas had traditionally stayed when he was in the Holy Land. So at Christmas, I told my kids that they didn't need to worry about Santa Claus not finding their house because he used to live next door. And where we live now is right over the side of what's called David's Wells. And I walk down the street and I go to the place where Jesus was born. So the more time I spend in these, the closer and closer it comes. And in times of difficulty, increasingly, I will literally just go to the place where Jesus experienced something. I study spiritual accompaniment in the Ignatian tradition. And one of the things that we ask people when they're in a difficult situation is, can you think of a time when Jesus was in a similar situation? And one of the things that touches me is that I've never, ever had somebody say no. That really, anytime we're in difficulty, we can look to the Gospels and find a moment where Jesus experienced something that can somehow speak to us and guide us, that we can learn from how he reacted. Sometimes it can give us permission to do things that we didn't think that we could, like be angry, or to feel betrayed, or to love. You may have read the article I wrote in America Magazine, which really was during the last war in Gaza, when I didn't know what to do. And so I simply went to Calvary. I went to Calvary and I prayed and I spoke to Jesus. And I tried to understand, what did Jesus do in those moments? And I realized Jesus loved. And it was the most impossible thing. It was the last thing I wanted to hear. It was very inconvenient. And yet Jesus loved. Jesus loved from the cross. Jesus loved and forgave those who put him there. Jesus loved the thieves beside him. Jesus's ability to love beyond love was something that I needed in that moment. And that's something that I still try to do. I guess one last thing is I recently wrote a book about Thésée. Thésée is a monastery in France, an ecumenical monastery that they have been coming to Jerusalem for some years. So I know some of the brothers. So I wrote I went and interviewed a bunch of the brothers there. And I learned a little bit about what created this monastery, where they sing songs in all kinds of different languages, and there are brothers from all over the world. And two things struck me. Brother Roger, who is the founder, his grandmother during the First World War, she had two sons who were fighting on the front lines. And she didn't know what to do. She felt totally hopeless. So she, as a Protestant, went every day and prayed in the Catholic Church. That's it. She had no idea what it meant or why it mattered, but she just decided to do this little thing. And when Brother Roger, her grandson, founded Thésée, he was inspired by that act. The belief that a little thing can matter, that a little thing, even if we don't know why or how, when it matters will be beyond us, that these things really do matter. The other thing that he did when he created this community of people from around the world praying together was that he called it a parable. And this has really guided me. A parable of communion, which is the idea that if a small community can show that something is possible, then it becomes a parable. It speaks beyond itself, and people can look to it to see the kingdom, essentially. And that's really helped me to make sense of my own life. And this is what I often tell young people when I speak to them. How can your life be a parable? How can you do in your life, with your friendships, with your relationships, with the things that you care about, how can this be a parable that people can look to witness something and say, oh, it's possible. Maybe it's only possible with those 5 people, but by seeing that, it opens up a door. It opens up a door of possibility. And so that's something that's really helped me to make sense of my life here, is to say my relationships matter, my friendships matter, the people I care about and who care about me matter, because again, it's that math. If people can look to this small thing, I believe that it can open a door to see that something else is possible. And I think that every community can go on a journey to try to see how they might live as parables. So that's a gift in the last year that I've really spent a lot of time thinking about.
Thank you, Stephanie. I'm taking a deep breath, trying to breathe it all in. Geoffrey, I'm going to hand it over to you.
Well, thank you, Stephanie. There's a number of questions and comments in the chat, and many of which you've answered along the way, such as, we've heard about Calvary. Where do you see resurrection? And I heard you answer that. And there's a number about what can we do, and you've talked about paying attention and prayer and recognizing the importance of relationships and so on. But there's one that's, and I've explained that this is not going to be a political kind of action conversation, but there's one that's sort of a drumbeat's coming through, like how do we respond in the face of really unimaginable violence that's going on around us? I've heard about the relationships and the birds and so on, but what do you and your community do in response to other than just mourning the losses? Is there anything you can offer us there?
I can speak actually, because I think where this question is coming from is that this is not simply a question of the Middle East. And I can say that violence was something that I experienced early on in my life in the United States. My grandfather was murdered. My high school, the boy who sat next to me in math class was killed. The head cheerleader was murdered. I grew up in San Antonio, which had the highest drive-by shooting ratings when I was growing up. It was something very real to me. And so the question of what we do, I don't think that I don't think that I have the answer to that. What I can say is that this question of, I mean, you can imagine I read a lot of Dietrich Bonhoeffer. This question of how do we have a hope that's not cheap is really at the center of my life. This is the constant question. How can I have hope? How can I witness hope that is not evasive, that is not avoiding, that is not, and so I would say that, you know, there are the practical things to do in terms of legislation, in terms of, you know, political action. But I think the most important thing is to be in contact with people who have suffered from it. For this not to be an abstract problem. I think we should never allow problems to be abstract. I mean, I think one of the reasons that I moved to Bethlehem was because I didn't want my hope to be cheap. And to be with the people who are struggling and to love everyone from that place, that's real. That's to love from a place of reality, not to love from a place of being evasive. So all I can say is I think in every instance, try to be close to people who have suffered from things. For us, as Pope Francis said, the smell of sheep, you know, these things should be part of our realities. So for me, that's always the first question. Is this something that I think about because I read about it on the news? Or is it something that I think about because in some way it's part of my life? And when it's part of our life, that's where answers come from. Real answers, not abstract answers or political answers. Or real answers for me always come out of experience.
Yeah, thank you. There are many people saying how appreciative they are of your writing and how useful it is and so on. But one question about sort of life on the ground is about how it is raising children and their schooling. I mean, do they go to school with Muslims? How does that work?
They go to school. My kids go to the French school. My husband is French, which is in Jerusalem. So that means every day they have to, since we've moved here, every day they have to wake up and go there. The French school, an old school in Jerusalem, which is half Palestinian and half international. So because my kids have been there since they were young, and the majority of the international students are coming in and out, their closest friends are Palestinians, because those are the ones who have stayed there as long as they have stayed there. And so they always have things like, you know, wanting to fast. You know, every year they say that they're going to try to fast during Ramadan and they never do because it's too hard, but all of their friends are fasting. And I remember asking my son, who are your most religious friends? And he said, oh, my Muslim friends. And so that's also something for them to experience deeply, sort of devout faith coming from other places. The move to Bethlehem was hard for kids, you know, and for me, it's been hard for me to think about, how are my kids not going to blame me? How are my kids not going to ask, why did you do this to me? How can we explain that there's a meaning to choosing a life that on the surface might be more difficult? And I would have never chosen it if I didn't think that there was not going, you know, I made the choice for joy. I truly, truly, truly believe that there's more joy when we make those choices. But they have to experience that. That's something nobody else can tell them. And so there's the anxiety of hoping that will be the case. And you know, and sometimes that takes time. My kids also have the cynicism of having grown up in war. I remember we were still at Tantur, the last place we lived in Jerusalem, and it was 2 wars ago, I think, yeah, and there were some air raid sirens. And so there was one that was kind of far away, but I told the kids, like, let's go, let's just practice, right? Since there's a siren, let's just practice. So then my oldest son said, oh, let me put on a shirt. So he went and put on a shirt. And then my middle son said, just a second, let me eat a banana before I die. So he went and grabbed a banana. But they have the humor and the sort of disposition of people who have grown up with difficulty. And it takes time to make sure that, you know, they're not hiding anything. On the other hand, Uvalde was 30 minutes from my house. You know, I grew up 30 minutes from Uvalde. So I'm not sure that what my children are experiencing is any different from what American kids their age are experiencing too. Unfortunately, it's not an easy time to be a child. One thing I would say that I love about them is that they're, you know, my husband is French, so they're Franco-American Palestinian somehow. And so you'll see in the street, if an American comes up to them and say, where are you from? They'll say, I'm from Texas. Like they've never been to Texas. They say, where a French person says, where are you from? They'll say, I'm from the Alps. You know, somebody from here comes, they'll say, I'm from Bethlehem. And it's always true. Like their ability to hold these different parts of themselves, I think is really beautiful. And I think this is going to be a huge gift that they can offer to the world, that they can see themselves in all of these different aspects and still be fully, uniquely themselves. But yeah, they're great. I mean, they have all the challenges of being kids whose dad is a priest. I think but they're wonderful children.
There's a question about, thank you, Stephanie. There's a question about your community, Christian community in Bethlehem, and Harvey asks, when last in Jerusalem a decade plus ago, we heard of the sharp decline in Palestinian Christian communities. How do you see the trends? Will there be Christians in Bethlehem in another decade?
This is a great question. This is really a look at the real. I mean, my stance on this has really been deeply informed by my work with Syrians and Iraqis, because Iraq has lost, I think, 80% of its Christians since 2003. Syria has lost massive amounts of its Christians. And here there can still be a kind of taboo against talking about it, but everybody knows it. And so yeah, it's the big elephant in the room. Where will there be Christians? I mean, people talk about, it's not a matter of if my children will leave, it's a matter of when, you know, and then they leave and people feel very guilty. And in our community, I mean, there's very few young people, but our community on a good Sunday has 15 people in it. We're 1% in Jerusalem. Bethlehem has a larger percentage of Christians, but I believe that people will stay if there's a meaning to why they stay. If they just stay in order for it to be difficult, for them to be frightened, for them to feel between populations, to suffer as minorities, they won't stay. And I think part of what international groups can do is to communicate how much their presence matters, how much their presence as local Christians matter, how much it matters to the global Christian community that there are local Christians in the land where Jesus was, praying and living a witness as Christians. And so that's a gift that every community abroad can give. And then people are proud, but people need that. People need to be reminded that there's a reason to stay. So we think a lot about the future. and what will happen to Christians not only here, but in Iraq and in Syria. In our particular community, the Syriac Catholic community, the majority of our Christians were in Iraq and Syria. And so, yeah, we worry about the future, because when they leave and they go to Australia or America, there won't be a Syriac church. So they'll just go to the closest church. And so we're very, very aware of the fact that our particular tradition is in grave danger. Yes. So I've always felt it's very important to be honest about this, honest about how critical the situation is, but also to not be hopeless about it. That's not always easy.
I know that it's the Maronites are another Syriac Christian tradition. Are there any Maronite? Do you have any? Are there any Maronites near you? What's the difference?
The Maronites are similar. We have a lot of similarities in the liturgy, but they're mostly from Lebanon. There is a community that is in Jerusalem. There's a very good relationship between our church and the Maronite church. But the church that is closest to us is the Syrian Orthodox Church. So there's the Syrian Orthodox Church and the Syrian Catholic Church. We both have communities in Bethlehem, and the clergy are very, very close. This is a very strong ecumenical relationship. They attend one another's services. They're friends. Part of this is because, this is all rather new to me because I married into this. I grew up Roman Catholic, but both of these communities came out of the SIFO, which is the massacres against Syriac Christians in southeastern Turkey in 1915. So they all came during that period. And so they have that history in common. They have the history of the Syriac language and their liturgy in common. So that's a very strong relationship here. Yeah.
Well, there's lots of notes of appreciation, which I hope at some point you'll be able to take a look at. Are there other questions for Stephanie along the lines of what she's been asking about?
I'm just looking at the questions myself. So I saw the one about resurrection, and I thought that I would speak to that a bit more, because as many of you know, resurrection is something which is deeply emphasized in the Middle East. In fact, Easter here is very much the biggest holiday of the year. And even Holy Saturday is called Sabbat Nur, the Saturday of light, with the idea that the light is present even in the tomb. So this emphasis on resurrection has been really, really transformative for me. And again, the monastery of Teze has helped me with this. The founder, he said that he used to start every new initiative on Easter Sunday with the idea that everything that we do should begin with Easter. And so I've really been thinking about that a lot, which is how can resurrection not just be something that I believe in the abstract, but the place from which I start, And that, for example, informs the way that I talk about local Christians disappearing, or talks about sort of relationships that are difficult, or it's the belief that the resurrection is real, that love is stronger than death, and that can mean starting out on things that don't make any sense. That can making choices that don't make sense, but make sense from a resurrection perspective. And so making discernments from the place of resurrection can mean moving to Bethlehem. It can mean all kinds of crazy things, but it's starting from a different place, which is the belief that God is really with us, and that love is stronger than everything, and that things that don't make sense makes sense in, as they say, the upside down logic of the Gospels, where maybe there's a different logic to how we live our lives. I hope, or maybe this is the way I justify my crazy decisions, but I hope that it's coming from a place of resurrection.
Thank you. Could you, I wrote my undergraduate thesis on Dietrich Bonhoeffer, and he's been a companion the whole way. Could you say a little bit more about what you're thinking about when you turn to Bonhoeffer in the place where you live?
Yeah, I would say really, I mean, Bonhoeffer is, for me, really the example for so many of us of not being cheap, you know, of really being with the real. And, you know, I've always wrestled with his decision, you know. I think a lot of us Christians have wrestled with his decision, and it's a great challenge for me because I don't know the answer. And so it's very easy, especially for me, when I deal with issues of nonviolence or issues of, you know, is there ever a situation in which there should be violence? Are we living in a situation of absolute nonviolence? What does this mean in terms of my children? These are things that I absolutely don't have answers for. And so Dietrich Bonhoeffer is, for me, proof that I don't have the answer, you know, proof that I don't have the answer because he did something that didn't make sense. So I often say, though, you know, would we consider him a saint if he had succeeded? We would have considered him a hero, but would he still be a saint? I don't know. But these really questions about violence, about what we do in these situations, about when do we intervene, and about his absolute insistence of living in reality and not arriving at, a cheap grace, has been really, really important to me. So I don't know, whenever there's a difficulty, I was in Tantur, which has a huge theological library. So it was very useful. I could just, an ecumenical theological library that I could just go and read. So yeah, so the idea of not arriving at anything that's cheap, but also this question, like I said, Bonhoeffer became important to me because Father Paolo, my teacher, he essentially joined the revolution, even though he was completely for nonviolence. And then he was kidnapped going to speak to al-Baghdadi, which I thought was the stupidest decision in the world. And this realization that I don't know what goes into other people's discernment processes. That's something we also learn in spiritual accompaniment. I cannot, unless it's obvious. In most cases, if somebody is living a life in God, you don't know what's right for them. They know because they discerned with God. You can help them discern, but ultimately it's with God. And so I look at somebody like Bonhoeffer, I look at somebody like my teacher, Father Paolo, and I can disagree with some things, but truly these were holy men. And so they put me in front of the limits of what I know. I hope they make me a little bit more humble. And both of them lived in the real. I think that we could use our Christianity to avoid things, especially in a time of war. We can use our dedication to nonviolence to avoid difficult things. And so I want to understand what it means to be dedicated to those things and not avoid things. And they help me, even if, I disagree with some decisions.
Stephanie, you have a pilgrimage house, and we are, St. Albans is preparing for another pilgrimage next spring, next Lent. Could you say something about what pilgrims mean to you and what, and what, if anything, we could bring?
Well, pilgrims are very dear to me. I've spent much of my life as a pilgrim. We always say here that there are different kinds of travelers, and we love pilgrims. I think, experiencing the land, the fifth gospel is something that if anybody can afford to do it in a lifetime, it just changes the text. It just opens the text. And when you go to a place, you realize that it's not only holy because of what happened there. It's holy because you're participating in a chain of people who have been going to this place and praying there. So it's such an experience of participating in something bigger, of being part of a bigger story. I mean, going to a place where the stones are literally worn away because people have touched them. It's so profound. So I think it's just, I mean, as I said, even living here, I experience my life as a pilgrim. I, every few days, will go to the place where Jesus was born, or I will go to the Holy Sepulchre. Just when I lived in the old city, I would just stop in on the way to buy a chicken. You know, this desire to grow closer to the Gospels, I think, is such a beautiful, beautiful thing. And what you can bring, I think there are two things to bring. One is that the challenges of sectarianism are that religion can become an identity. It can become what's on your passport, you know, what your name is. So in a sectarian conflict, any witness of profound faith is a remembering what faith is really about. This is so, so, so important. Remembering that and reminding others, giving a witness of faith as something that's coming out of belief, out of spirituality. And in this case, it's so, so important to be with the local Christians and to tell them that they matter, to listen to their stories, to be witnesses to their witness. I think all of that is so, so important. So yeah, I think it's a gift for anybody who comes, but it's always a gift for the people here. I mean, you should hear, especially after COVID, we've lost so many people, and people just light up now in Bethlehem when people come. They really do.
And last question, that is, we've heard about Muslims and where you live and so on. Do you have much interaction with Jews?
Yes, that's always I mean, yes, it feels silly to say that because, I mean, I have many, many, many Jewish friends, but it always feels weird to say that because, of course, you don't think of them as my Jewish friends. So it's always strange when I'm asked that question because, yeah, I would say a great many of my closest friends are Jewish. A great many of my friends who are writers are Jewish. So yeah, that's always been a part of my life here. That continues to be a part of my life from here going there. But I wanted to actually speak to something about that. I remember when we were preparing for this and I was saying that you know, we have the commandment to love our neighbor. And so everybody has to ask who their neighbor is. And so that, you know, that changes their decisions. Well, one thing that really influenced me when I first came here is there is a priest, a Catholic priest named David Neuhaus. I don't know if any of you have heard of him. He's a wonderful man. He is a Jew from South Africa who came here when he was a teenager and converted to Catholicism and became a priest. He's completely fluent in Arabic, and he's also obviously fluent in Hebrew. And he was the head of the Hebrew-speaking community here. He also teaches in the Arabic-speaking seminaries. And once he said something that I've never forgotten. He said that as Catholics here, that we have the Hebrew-speaking community. We have the migrants, which are the largest community here, the migrants mainly from the Philippines, and we have the Arabic-speaking Christians. He said, all of those are ours. And we cannot ever say that community doesn't belong to me. We don't have the right to say the Hebrew-speaking Christians, they don't belong to me, or the Palestinian Christians don't belong to me, or the migrants don't belong to me. And that really taught me that it's not only, of course I have friends, but they also belong to me. It's not just, okay, I have my left, it's that, and then they belong to me. They profoundly impact the way in which I live in the world. Muslims do, Jews do, Yazidis do. All of these people are part of who I am, and their faith has profoundly impacted my faith. So that seems important for me to say. On the other hand, I remember when I lived in Lebanon, I was attacked for being pro-Palestinian. I was supposed to give a bunch of talks. I was like young, I was in my 20s, supposed to give a bunch of talks, and I was attacked for being pro-Palestinian. And so the guy in charge of it, he asked me, well, could you defend yourself by giving, telling us all of your Jewish friends, right? And I said, I'm not anti-Semitic, but that's anti-Semitic. So yes, many Jewish friends, part of my life, but very awkward for me to talk about all of these very, very good friends I have without feeling like I'm somehow, talking about those relationships in a way that I don't live them. It's normal here. I mean, you go to Shabbat dinners, you go to iftar dinners. These are our neighbors, and these are my friends. And in many ways, since my family is so far away, honestly, these are my family. When something happens, these Jewish and Muslim and Christian friends are the people who I go to before I go to my own family. So yeah, there's a level. And just maybe one more thing to say about that. Some of you who have visited here may have been surprised that we all live fully in our faith. So I'm not friends with them because they put their faith on the side and I put my faith on the side, and so we can be together. We're all fully and completely in our faiths, and it's from that place that we're friends. And that's something that's I feel is lucky. I'm profoundly blessed to have that experience with other people.
Well, Stephanie, I'm going to turn this back to Jim, but in concert with our other presenters, you have borne witness to the importance of relationship, and that gives me hope for an intractable situation. And I'm so grateful to you, and thank you. So I'll turn this back to Jim. And I hope you see some of the accolades in the chat.
I'll have a look after, thanks.
Thank you, Geoffrey. And thank you, Stephanie, so very, very much. A great conclusion to this series. I'm going to close with two things. The first is for Stephanie, because I don't think she's ever heard this story. And the second is for the group. And I think it points to what Geoffrey and I had set out to do when we conceived this three-part series. So Stephanie, I know you and Frederick have 3 children, and this is a story about one of your children, but just let Joseph know that at the beginning of the season of Lent, there was a certain preacher that lived at Tantur Ecumenical Institute for 6 weeks, hearing them playing basketball outside, and I recalled in the sermon the moment when I was trying to forget about Lent, and your son covered up the sign on the label for the soup that was lentil soup, and he covered up the I and the L with his thumb and just looked at me and winked, telling me how aware he was of what the season was, and reminding me of where I was. So you can share that with him and tell him that I'll never forget it. And he's been mentioned from a pulpit in Washington, D.C. in the Episcopal Church. The last thing that I'm going to do, ladies and gentlemen, before we close is read a poem from Naomi Shihab Nye, who has written very kindly about Stephanie and the way she writes. There's 3 stanzas in the poem. And I believe it speaks to this work that we are all called to, no matter who we are and where we come from. This is a poem by Naomi Shihab Nye, and it is called Kindness. Before you know what kindness really is, you must lose things, feel the future dissolve in a moment like salt in a weakened broth. What you held in your hand, what you counted and carefully saved, all this must go so you know how desolate the landscape can be between the regions of kindness. How you ride and ride, thinking the bus will never stop. The passengers eating maize and chicken will stare out the window forever. Before you learn the tender gravity of kindness, you must travel where the Indian in a white poncho lies dead by the side of the road. You must see how this could be you, how he too was someone who journeyed through the night with plans and the simple breath that kept him alive. Before you know kindness as the deepest thing inside, you must know sorrow as the other deepest thing. You must wake up with sorrow. You must speak to it till your voice catches the thread of all sorrows and you see the size of the cloth. Then it is only kindness that makes sense anymore. Only kindness that ties your shoes and sends you out into the day to gaze at bread. Only kindness that raises its head from the crowd of the world to say, it is I you have been looking for, and then goes with you everywhere like a shadow or a friend. Peace to all of you. Peace to you, Stephanie Saldaña. Thank you for concluding this series with us. God bless us all.